The sun rose slow, casting long fingers across a construction site that once breathed grass and silence. The ground was no longer soft. It had been broken, ripped open by machines whose arms never tired, their claws pulling at the skin of the earth without apology. What once was soil had hardened into grids, framed by rebar, sectioned by surveyors, sterilized by blueprints no longer drawn by hand. Elijah stood beyond the caution tape. He didn't flinch at the roar of cranes or the sharp beep of reversing loaders. He watched the site like someone remembering a face before surgery, wondering what would remain after the reconstruction. Dust blew in coils across his boots. He wore the same jacket he'd worn since spring, layered with patches not from fashion but necessity. The world around him pulsed with progress. Glossy billboards displayed renderings of what was to come. A glimmering tower with mirrored glass, rooftop gardens, and sustainable interiors made of imported materials. It was beautiful in the way forgetting often is. They had forgotten. He hadn't. His grandfather's hands once turned this land. Not symbolically, not the poetic gesture urban developers love to romanticize, but literally. With fingers cracked by frost and sun, the old man had pulled roots, leveled brush, planted seeds. Elijah remembered the sound of shovel against clay, the way silence had lived here, back when you could hear the wind between trees. But now came footfall, heels, polished shoes, taxis, the constant digital hum of devices recalibrating to towers overhead. And with it came the presumption that the place had always belonged to them, that Elijah was a trespasser, a relic, a mistake. He had walked the perimeter of the building 3 times before a clipboard stopped him. A man with gelled hair and an unearned voice asked what he was doing. Elijah answered with silence, then a nod toward the horizon. The clipboard didn't understand. He radioed for security. They came in pairs, always. Young men paid to uphold boundaries they didn't write. They approached like they were the land's defenders. Unaware the soil beneath their feet whispered the name of the man they were pushing away. He showed no documents. Not yet. Instead, he walked back across the avenue and sat on the same bench he'd chosen weeks ago. It faced the tower head-on. No shade, no comfort, just an unobstructed view of the lie unfolding. Behind him, the city stretched toward the water. Glass buildings cast reflections instead of shadows. Inside them, meetings convened. Metrics were evaluated. And slowly emails began circulating regarding the vagrant on the bench outside. Real estate agents warned tenants. PR assistants were told to prepare statements. Image had to be managed. But Elijah remained. He didn't shout, didn't ask, just watched. He noticed the moments others didn't. The way pigeons skirted the curb near the tower but never crossed. How the soil around the old oak resisted the concrete being laid too close. He knew nature's resistance. It was never loud, just stubborn. By noon, he opened his bag and pulled out a folded binder. Inside, the original surveyor's map. Not a scan, not a copy. The real one, ink-faded, paper-creased, notarized in a time before barcodes. His fingers passed over the edge of the tract marked in his grandfather's name. The final lot, never transferred. The one they'd built on anyway. He hadn't contested it yet. He was waiting, not out of fear but precision. Elijah had learned from the land. You didn't pull seedlings too early. You waited for the roots to deepen. When you spoke, it had to be when the silence was loudest. Later that week, a woman passed by and tossed a coin near his feet. She didn't look at him, didn't even break stride. The metal clinked on pavement, spun twice, and landed face up. He didn't pick it up. He didn't need charity. He needed recognition. By Friday, a junior manager posted a sign near the lobby, "No loitering. Violators will be reported." It was cleanly printed, laminated, taped with exact corners. It was aimed at him, though it never said his name. But the land knew it. The cement hadn't hardened yet. And beneath the building's glossy entrance, a forgotten clause rested dormant, ready to awaken. Elijah waited, not for justice, for timing. Because this wasn't a fight. It was reclamation. He returned before the city did, long before the espresso carts opened or the revolving doors unlocked. Before the morning runners came through with their headphones and unbothered glances. Before the suits filled the plaza with calls about capital and cohesion, the streets still wore their early hush, a breath held before the machinery of image took over. Elijah stood beneath the newly raised sign that bore the tower's name, the Keystone, etched in brushed brass. It was bolted to stone and positioned at an angle that caught sunrise for photo ops. There was irony in the name, though no one else seemed to taste it. Because Elijah had been the keystone. His grandfather, the cornerstone. The land, the base of all of it. But now it was claimed by logos and light. He moved past the entrance. Slowly. Not to be defiant, but to be undeniable. His presence was not a protest. It was precedent. He carried no sign, no backpack. Only that same weather-worn binder in one hand and in the other a folded chair, the kind you might find at a fishing dock or a forgotten porch. He placed the chair in front of the cafe attached to the lobby. He didn't sit. Not yet. The cafe workers were first to notice. One of them, a young man with a mambun and barista badge, offered a cautious smile. Not judgmental. Just hesitant. Like he wasn't sure if this was his place to interfere. Then came the building manager. A woman in a fitted blazer, phone always near her mouth. She didn't stop walking when she saw Elijah. She dialed, then passed, speaking words that sounded composed but were made of panic. Words like liability and property and visual obstruction. Elijah set the binder down on his lap and waited. At 9:12 a.m. a man in a security uniform approached. He was young. Not hardened yet. He spoke with his hands, one of them twitching toward the walkie on his hip. Elijah did not move. Instead, he reached into the binder and withdrew one sheet. Original deed. Parcel 409A, dated, signed, notarized. He offered it forward. The guard hesitated. Took it. Read it. Stared. Then called someone. That someone called someone else. By 9:45, two men in dark suits arrived. Not security. Not management. Legal. One of them carried a leather briefcase. The other had tired eyes. Both scanned Elijah with the kind of expression people reserve for unscheduled headaches. Elijah handed them the full binder. They didn't speak, but they flipped. Slowly. Each page marked with decades of inheritance, filings, proof of taxes paid, diagrams from before the city had grid lines. It wasn't just paperwork. It was time-bound, preserved, patient. When they were done, they looked at each other. Then they left. No orders. No threats. Just retreat. Because they knew. The mistake was theirs. The assumption that the land had changed hands when the old man passed was based on paperwork they had never verified. They thought history was malleable. That dirt could be tamed by contracts. That a man with soil under his nails had no place among towers. But they were wrong. Elijah remained seated. The day passed in quiet friction. Passers-by glanced at him. Some whispered. Others ignored. One woman snapped a photo from across the plaza, captioned it #UrbanDecay, and posted it without a second thought. By evening, the email reached the C-suite. Subject: urgent, legal claim 2 Keystone Lot. The tower, it turned out, was partially constructed over land never formally acquired. It had been understood to be included, but no official transfer existed. No compensation paid. No signed agreement from Elijah or his late grandfather. The legal team scrambled. The investors panicked. The marketing team buried themselves in spin. But Elijah? He just went home. Home was a modest place, worn but clean. A kitchen that smelled like cedar and history. Walls that had never known designer wallpaper but bore the marks of decades. Every nail hole was a memory. Every floorboard squeak, a voice. He sat that night at his table and flipped through the binder once more. Not out of doubt, out of reverence. His grandfather's handwriting still lingered in margins. Notes scribbled like secrets too sacred for outsiders. That night, Elijah slept with the window open. And the land, somewhere beneath towers and steel, seemed to exhale with him. Because for the first time in years, it had been seen. It began with a glitch. A subtle hiccup in the company's quarterly presentation. A slide that wouldn't load. A discrepancy in land documentation pulled up during an investor inquiry. A low-level analyst flagged it as non-critical, but someone higher up marked it red. From that moment, the panic spread like dye in water. Uncontained, unseen by the public, but staining everything underneath the surface. The Keystone Tower, now months from full launch, stood tall in marketing brochures. But underneath it, a fault line grew. Elijah didn't celebrate. He didn't retaliate. He didn't even adjust his schedule. Each morning, he arrived before sunrise and claimed the same position. Not to disrupt, but to remind. He sat in the same folding chair, beside the same tree that had survived the construction's brutal pruning, and placed the same binder on his lap. Some mornings, pigeons gathered near his feet. Other days, the wind whipped through the plaza and knocked over coffee cups before the cafe opened. The weather didn't care for lawsuits or reputations. Neither did Elijah. It wasn't long before the media arrived. At first, it was a single local reporter. A puff piece, they called it. Something to fill a gap between budget crises and street closures. A quiet man seated outside a billion-dollar structure he legally co-owned. But the image struck a nerve. A man with worn boots and a paper folder, looking calmly at the building that thought it had erased him. The article ran, "Tower built on forgotten man's land?" Spread. Other reporters followed. Then came camera crews. Then hashtags. Then opinion pieces. The public latched onto the contrast. The mythic symmetry of a man dismissed for being too dirty, now revealed to be the one who held the deed. Elijah didn't speak to cameras. Not out of fear. He simply didn't owe them answers. The land was his voice now. Inside the Keystone, crisis management meetings ran late into the night. Lawyers drafted statements soaked in ambiguity. Public relations teams crafted apologies that avoided blame. Their message was always the same. We are reviewing the matter with the utmost respect. But they still hadn't said his name. Because to name him would be to admit him. Instead, they tried silence. And Elijah matched it. He brought with him not just documents, but memory. While they scrambled, he remained still. The contrast burned through their image like acid on glass. Tenants began to notice. One woman, who had once told him to move along, now avoided eye contact. Another, who wore fitness gear even to her meetings, started taking photos of him from inside the elevator lobby. Curious now, not contemptuous. The tower's ground lease was re-examined. Whispers about halted units, frozen contracts, and pending permits began to leak from boardrooms. Still, Elijah didn't gloat. He trimmed his nails, combed his hair, came every day dressed in the same layered clothing. He still looked like someone they wouldn't invite to dinner. But now they couldn't pretend he didn't belong. One morning, the woman from the PR team tried to approach him. She brought a coffee, too sweet, with his name misspelled on the side. He didn't accept it. She asked if he'd like to come inside. He didn't answer. She offered to talk options. He looked to the soil near his feet and studied it like scripture. Because he knew what they were trying to do. They weren't acknowledging him. They were trying to reframe him, to spin the narrative into something palatable. He wasn't interested. Later that week, construction paused. Officially, it was due to zoning inconsistencies. Unofficially, it was because Elijah's name was now being whispered in city planning departments and courthouse hallways. His grandfather had once told him, "Land is louder than money. It listens longer." Elijah understood that now. He didn't need to fight. He just needed to outlast them. And the land was on his side. The city didn't like uncertainty. It liked sleek lines, scheduled press releases, sanitized openings with ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and tall glasses of champagne. It liked deals sealed in conference rooms where the air was conditioned and the lighting always flattering. But the ground they built on didn't follow their clock. And neither did Elijah. Weeks passed. The weather shifted. Leaves browned, then fell. The wind pulled at scarves instead of sleeves. And still, Elijah sat quiet, deliberate, and unrelenting. The bench he once used was removed under the pretense of plaza renovations. In its place, they installed a planter box with seasonal mums. He brought his chair closer. The planter couldn't erase presence. A letter arrived at his address. Thick envelope. Legal watermark. A settlement offer. The number was printed cleanly, 7 digits, followed by terms that promised non-disclosure and no further claims. The city wanted to buy its image back. He folded the offer and slipped it into the back of the binder. Behind the deeds. Behind the blueprints. Behind the photo of his grandfather standing on the same soil in black and white. They thought money would change the past. But Elijah wasn't here for revenge. He was here for the record. Inside the tower, decisions frayed. Contractors pulled equipment. Investors filed motions. Luxury tenants paused leases. The project, once hailed as the centerpiece of a district renaissance, now sat paralyzed, gleaming, incomplete, ashamed of its shadow. Then came the audit. Triggered not by Elijah but by the city itself, spurred by press, public outcry, and anonymous tips from within. Inspectors combed permits. One noticed an irregularity in the foundational zoning. Another flagged an omission in environmental clearance. It all traced back to the same lot, the one they hadn't legally acquired. Elijah watched it unfold like rain-feeding roots. He didn't speak. He let them unravel. And while they spun in circles, he walked the perimeter. He touched the bark of the old oak still standing beside the sidewalk. He ran his palm over the stone where his grandfather once carved initials barely visible now. He crouched near the edge of the garden that hadn't been there before but which now grew in soil layered atop soil, an accidental offering. One evening he planted something. A single sapling. Near the northeast corner. He didn't mark it. He didn't fence it. Just placed it. Watered it. And let it be. No one noticed at first. But days later, the maintenance team clipped it. Tossed it with the trash. The next morning, Elijah brought another. Planted again. This time deeper. The pattern repeated: remove, replace, erase, return. Until someone asked, why? And suddenly that tiny tree became a symbol. Not of defiance. Of permanence. Because what you plant with intent, the land remembers. Eventually, the tower executives requested a meeting. They offered conference rooms. Catered lunches. Mediation. Elijah declined. He offered them a seat instead. Outside. No walls. No curtains. Just the open air and the sound of wind brushing through unfinished steel. One executive came. He brought documents, talking points, rehearsed empathy. Elijah brought silence. The executive spoke of compromise, of mutual benefit, of shared progress. Elijah pointed to the tree. Not planted in protest. Planted to remind. The executive left without signatures. Later that week, the company filed to freeze development indefinitely. The public narrative shifted. News anchors stopped referring to Elijah as a local squatter and began calling him the rightful landholder. Profiles emerged. Journalists sought interviews. Scholars debated ethics. And quietly, the land regained its voice. The winter came without ceremony. No snow. Just wind and the slow withdrawal of color from the city's palette. The tower, once hailed as the flagship of renewal, now stood like a monument to oversight. Lights still flickered in its upper floors, powered more by pride than function. Below, in the plaza, Elijah remained. Not every day now. Some days were spent walking the outer boundaries of the district, tracing where stone met grass, where history had been layered over but not erased. He knew the paths his grandfather once took. He followed them like breath, invisible, essential, unforgotten. Inside city chambers, Elijah's name was finally spoken aloud. It came during a closed session of the zoning committee. The phrase used was undisputed ownership. No objections. No caveats. The land, Lot 409A, was officially his in the eyes of every board, ledger, and court. But he already knew that. He didn't need confirmation from those who had once ignored his presence. What mattered was what came next. Developers sent new offers. Not to buy. To partner. They wanted his story now. Not as an obstacle, but as a narrative. Something they could fold into brochures and shareholder meetings. A legacy preserved. A collaboration rooted in heritage. He declined. They didn't understand. Because Elijah didn't want a wing named after his family. He wanted the land to breathe again. So he filed his own plan. Quietly. Precisely. Without spectacle. An application to convert Lot 409A into a community garden and open-air museum. Not for profit. Not for clout. For memory. The city hesitated. Then relented. They had taken too much without asking. Now they listened. The tower began to lose tenants. Not because of Elijah. Because of time. The story had shifted. The ground no longer trusted ambition not backed by humility. No one wanted to live above a scandal immortalized in photos, hashtags, and silence. So they moved out. Floor by floor. The developers rebranded, then quietly listed the property. Elijah did not bid. He had no interest in their structure. He had the soil. And the soil remembered him. The garden was built with community hands. Not contractors. Children came with gloves too big for their fingers. Elders came with recipes from when vegetables came from yards instead of packages. The city donated benches. Elijah repurposed wood from construction leftovers to build trellises and walkways. The sapling he had planted now had brothers. Dozens. He named none of them. They didn't need names to grow. Visitors began to arrive. Tourists, locals, students. A plaque was installed not about the scandal, not about the tower, but about the man who never left. This land was never empty. It waited for someone who remembered. The tower still stood in the background. It was no longer the center. Elijah came every morning with thermos in hand, walking the rows of herbs and vegetables, running his palm along leaves, checking soil like it spoke a language only he heard. Because it did. The headlines had faded. The news cycle had moved on. But he hadn't come for attention. He came for roots. For things that couldn't be paved over. The spring arrived slowly, as if testing whether the city was ready to soften. Crocuses broke through the edges of the pavement like quiet defiance, and the breeze carried warmth again, not yet a promise, but an opening. Elijah stood at the edge of his land, watching. Children chased wind among the raised beds. Volunteers pulled weeds and laughed without performance. People came not to observe but to participate. The land didn't require credentials, titles, or clean shoes. Only intention. The tower behind him had changed hands again. Its signage was gone. Some floors remained empty, some converted to art studios, nonprofits, co-ops, the types of tenants no longer lured by luxury but grounded by meaning. There were talks of renaming it after the district's roots. Elijah was asked for input. He gave none. He knew names came and went. But land remembered acts, not labels. He walked slowly through rows of tomatoes, pausing to tie back a vine. Across the garden, a mural had begun to stretch across the once blank wall of the adjacent utility building. It wasn't about him. It was about hands brown, black, wrinkled, small, pressed into the earth, giving it shape. He had not painted it. But someone understood. In the evenings, the garden became quiet again. Some days he sat near the same oak tree, now surrounded by wildflowers. Others, he walked the stone path winding toward the south gate, where his grandfather once stood with a rusted shovel and a jaw set against history. He brought out the binder less often now. Not because it was less important, but because the proof had already grown into something physical, something living. The pages were no longer his shield. They were simply memory. One day, a woman approached with a young boy. They didn't speak. She simply nodded toward the garden and placed something at the foot of the tree. A small jar of soil, labeled with the name of a place hundreds of miles away. Elijah picked it up, held it, then poured it gently into the roots. The garden accepted it, because soil, no matter how far it travels, always remembers where it came from. He turned back to the garden and saw something he hadn't before. A bench with no nameplate, hand-carved, facing the sunlight. Not a throne, place to rest. It hadn't been there yesterday. He sat, watched the sky shift between gold and dusk, listened as a few final birds stitched their notes into the coming dark. In that moment, no one told him to leave. No one whispered about dirt. No one asked if he belonged. Because the land already knew. And finally, so did everyone else.